Napoleon Bonaparte did not rise because he was born powerful. He rose because Europe was unstable, and because he understood something most men never fully grasp. When institutions weaken, speed matters more than tradition. When certainty collapses, decisiveness looks like genius. Napoleon arrived at the center of history during a moment when old systems were already dying. Monarchies were losing legitimacy. Republics were struggling to survive their own ideals. Armies were no longer controlled solely by kings, but by urgency, fear, and momentum. He did not invent this chaos. He learned how to move inside it faster than anyone else. That is the first mistake people make when trying to understand Napoleon. They treat him as an anomaly, a singular force, a man larger than his time. In reality, he was deeply shaped by the fractures around him. His ambition did not appear out of nowhere. It formed inside a world that was already coming apart. Napoleon was neither purely a hero nor simply a tyrant. He was a system builder who believed order justified force, a reformer who centralized power, a military innovator who depended on constant war, a ruler who claimed stability while creating permanent motion. His life cannot be reduced to victories and defeats. Battles explain only part of his rise, and even less of his fall. The real story lies in how he thought about control, legitimacy, and speed, in how he understood people, institutions, and fear. Napoleon believed that authority did not come from tradition alone. It came from results, from action, from the visible ability to impose clarity on confusion. This belief shaped everything he touched: the army, the law, the state, and even his own image. From an early age, he learned what it meant to be an outsider, not simply socially, but culturally, not fully French, not fully Corsican, always slightly apart. That distance mattered. It trained him to observe rather than belong, to calculate rather than trust. He grew up during the final decades of an old Europe, a Europe that claimed permanence but was already hollowing out. When revolution arrived, it did not feel like chaos to him. It felt like opportunity structured by danger. Where others hesitated, he advanced. Where others debated legitimacy, he delivered outcomes. Where others waited for permission, he acted. This is why Napoleon frightened people even before he ruled them. He did not fit into the moral categories of his time. He was not loyal to monarchy, but not committed to republican ideals either. He respected law, but only if it served order. He admired history, but believed he could outrun it. He treated war not as an exception, but as a system. Continuation of governance by other means. He understood logistics as deeply as tactics, psychology as deeply as firepower. He knew morale could collapse before armies did. Most importantly, he understood that power depends on momentum. Once momentum slows, legitimacy erodes. And once legitimacy erodes, force alone is never enough. Napoleon spent his life accelerating. Faster campaigns, faster reforms, faster decisions, faster concentration of authority. Speed protected him until it destroyed him. Because speed demands energy, and energy is finite. For years, Europe could not keep up with him. Coalitions formed slowly. Armies moved cautiously. Governments argued. Napoleon advanced while others reacted. This imbalance created his legend. But legends are fragile. They require constant reinforcement, and they collapse suddenly when doubt replaces awe. Napoleon tried to solve this problem the only way he knew how, by expanding control, by tightening systems, by demanding more from the same structures that had already carried him too far. His empire was not undone by a single defeat. It was undone by exhaustion, administrative, military, and psychological. The same clarity he imposed eventually narrowed his vision. The same decisiveness that once saved him later prevented adaptation. Exile revealed this more clearly than any battlefield. Removed from command, removed from motion, Napoleon was left with memory. And memory became his final instrument of power. He dictated. He corrected. He shaped the narrative of his own life. Even in isolation, he sought control over how history would remember him. That effort largely succeeded. Today, Napoleon still appears larger than life. His name stands for ambition, brilliance, and catastrophe all at once. He is cited by generals, politicians, and reformers, admired and condemned, often by the same people. But fascination alone is not understanding. To understand Napoleon is to understand how fragile systems create space for forceful individuals, how order and domination can look identical in moments of crisis, how control, once centralized, demands constant expansion to survive. It is also to understand the cost, not only in lives lost, but in institutions hollowed out by dependence on a single will. Napoleon did not simply conquer Europe. He reorganized it. He standardized laws, administration, and governance in ways that outlived him. At the same time, he normalized permanent warfare as a condition of stability. These contradictions are not incidental. They are the core of his story. This biography will not rush. It will not glorify, and it will not simplify. It will move carefully through the environments that shaped Napoleon, the choices that defined him, and the systems that both elevated and destroyed him. Because Napoleon Bonaparte was not inevitable. He was possible. And that distinction matters. Napoleon Bonaparte was born into a place that did not quite belong. Corsica, the island of his birth, had only recently been absorbed into France. For centuries it had existed at the edge of empires, ruled, traded, and abandoned by larger powers. Its people were accustomed to resistance, clan loyalty, and grievance. Authority arrived from the outside and rarely stayed long enough to earn trust. By the time Napoleon was born in 1769, Corsica's struggle had already left its mark. French rule was new, imposed by force after generations of local resistance led by Pasquale Paoli. The memory of independence had not faded. It lingered in language, customs, and resentment. Corsicans were technically French citizens, but culturally separate. That separation would shape Napoleon long before he understood it. His family belonged to the lower ranks of Corsican nobility, noble enough to claim status, but not wealthy enough to feel secure. This position carried an unusual tension. Expectations without resources, identity without power. From an early age, Napoleon learned that rank alone did not guarantee influence. Power had to be seized, defended, and justified through action. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, was ambitious and adaptable. He aligned himself with French authorities after the conquest, recognizing where opportunity now lay. This decision gave the family access to education and patronage, but it also placed them in an uneasy position among their own people. They were neither fully accepted by the French nor fully trusted by Corsican nationalists. Napoleon absorbed this contradiction quietly. He grew up speaking Corsican and Italian dialects before learning French. His accent never fully disappeared. Even later, among generals and courtiers, it marked him as different. Difference became one of his earliest defining experiences. In Corsica, loyalty was personal. Law was secondary to family, reputation, and retaliation. Feuds lasted generations. Authority was respected only when it proved itself. These conditions shaped Napoleon's earliest ideas about order. Stability was not abstract. It was enforced, maintained, defended against constant challenge. He was not a naturally sociable child. Contemporary accounts describe him as intense, withdrawn, and observant. He watched more than he spoke. He held grudges. He remembered slights. In an environment where honor mattered deeply, these traits could be dangerous, but they also trained him to calculate carefully before acting. Napoleon admired Pasquale Paoli in his youth. Paoli represented resistance, discipline, and leadership rooted in Corsican identity. For a time, Napoleon imagined himself as part of that tradition. He wrote passionately about Corsican independence and condemned French domination. His early political instincts were shaped not by loyalty to France, but by a desire for recognition within a struggling homeland. Yet opportunity required compromise. French military schools offered a path Corsica could not. Through his father's connections and the family's minor noble status, Napoleon gained entry into mainland education. Leaving the island was not simply geographic movement. It was a psychological break. On the mainland, Napoleon did not arrive as an equal. He arrived as a provincial outsider, poor, accented, isolated. His Corsican background, once a source of pride, became a liability. Classmates mocked his speech and manners. He did not blend in. He endured. This experience reinforced a lesson first learned in Corsica. Belonging was unreliable. Institutions mattered more than people. Rules mattered more than approval. Mastery mattered more than charm. Napoleon responded by withdrawing further into himself. He read obsessively. History, mathematics, geography. He studied the mechanics of power long before he possessed any. He admired figures who rose through discipline and force of will, rather than birthright alone. Alexander, Caesar. Leaders, who reshaped systems rather than inherited them. Corsica remained central to his identity even as distance grew. He wrote about it, defended it, argued over its future. But gradually, the island shifted from homeland to symbol, a place that had formed him but could not contain him. The rupture came during the French Revolution. As revolutionary politics radicalized, Corsica fractured internally. Paoli turned against the increasingly extreme direction of the revolution. Napoleon, by then committed to advancement within French military structures, chose a different path. Loyalty to opportunity replaced loyalty to origin. This decision was not sentimental, it was strategic. By siding with revolutionary France, Napoleon aligned himself with the strongest force shaping Europe. Corsica, isolated and divided, could offer only limitation. France offered scale, resources, a stage large enough to matter. When conflict erupted between Paoli's supporters and revolutionary authorities, the Napoleonic Bonaparte family was forced to flee the island. Their departure was hurried and bitter. Property was lost. Ties were severed. Corsica rejected them as decisively as France had once kept them at a distance. Napoleon never fully recovered from this second exile. The sense of betrayal hardened him. It taught him that loyalty is conditional, and survival requires decisive alignment. Neutrality invites destruction. Hesitation invites erasure. This pattern would repeat throughout his life. Corsica gave Napoleon three enduring traits. First, an instinctive suspicion of inherited legitimacy. Authority had to prove itself. Second, an acceptance of force as a stabilizing tool. Order was not natural, it was imposed. Third, a comfort with isolation. He did not need belonging to function. He needed purpose. These traits would later define his command style. He demanded results, not consensus. Loyalty was rewarded, but never assumed. Structures existed to serve outcomes, not tradition. Corsica also gave him something less obvious, an understanding of fragmentation. He had seen how divided communities weaken themselves, how internal disputes invite external control. This lesson stayed with him as he later governed fractured states and manipulated rival factions. Napoleon left Corsica behind, but he never escaped its influence. The island's instability, its resistance, and its unforgiving social codes shaped his earliest understanding of power. He learned that authority without enforcement dissolves quickly, that identity without strength invites domination. Most importantly, Corsica taught him that the world does not wait. It rewards those who move decisively while others argue over legitimacy. This lesson would guide him through revolution, war, and empire. But it would also limit him, because decisiveness, when unchecked, becomes rigidity, and rigidity, in time, breaks. Corsica forged Napoleon's hunger. France would give him the tools to act on it. Napoleon's education did not soften him. It sharpened him. When he arrived in mainland France as a young boy, he entered a world governed by rules he did not yet understand, and people who did not want him among them. Military schools were designed to produce officers loyal to the crown, trained in discipline, hierarchy, and obedience. For most students, they were stepping stones into an inherited future. For Napoleon, they were a test of survival. He arrived poor by aristocratic standards. His clothes were plain, his accent unmistakable, his background provincial. These differences were immediately noticed and rarely forgiven. He was mocked for his speech, his manners, his seriousness. He was not invited into circles of ease or privilege. He learned early that effort would not earn acceptance. Only competence might earn tolerance. Napoleon responded by withdrawing inward. He did not seek popularity. He sought mastery. At Brienne and later at the École Militaire in Paris, he became intensely focused on subjects that rewarded precision rather than charm. Mathematics, geometry, artillery science, history. These disciplines offered something social life did not: clarity. Problems had solutions. Systems had rules. Skill produced results regardless of background. Artillery, in particular, appealed to him. It required calculation, timing, and understanding terrain. It rewarded foresight. It punished improvisation without preparation. For a young man who distrusted spontaneity and valued control, it was a perfect fit. Napoleon read relentlessly, not casually, but with purpose. He did not read to be entertained. He read to extract patterns: ancient histories, biographies of commanders, political treatises. He analyzed how leaders rose, how they lost authority, and why states collapsed. He paid close attention to moments of transition, revolutions, successions, crises, because those were the moments when individuals mattered most. He was not drawn to abstract philosophy for its own sake. Ideas interested him only insofar as they explained power. Liberty, law, sovereignty, these were not ideals to him. They were tools, instruments to be applied, shaped, and enforced. This utilitarian approach set him apart from many of his contemporaries. While others debated principles, Napoleon focused on outcomes. He did not ask whether something was traditional or innovative. He asked whether it worked. Isolation reinforced this mindset. Without close friends or mentors to moderate his thinking, Napoleon developed internally. His confidence grew not from affirmation, but from private certainty. He trusted his own judgment because it was the only constant he had. This inward focus carried costs. He was emotionally guarded. He struggled to form deep personal attachments. Even later, when surrounded by allies and admirers, he remained fundamentally alone in decision-making. Consultation existed, but authority was never shared. At school, discipline was strict, but Napoleon tolerated it better than most. Structure gave him boundaries. Boundaries gave him room to think. He respected rules not because they were moral, but because they organized behavior. When rules failed to do so, he felt no loyalty to them. His instructors noticed his intelligence, but not always his temperament. He was stubborn, argumentative, unwilling to accept explanations that did not satisfy him. This was not rebellion for its own sake. It was insistence on coherence. He wanted systems to make sense. As the French monarchy drifted toward crisis in the late 1780s, Napoleon absorbed the tension. He watched as authority weakened, not through sudden collapse, but through indecision. Orders contradicted each other. Institutions hesitated. Leadership appeared uncertain. For Napoleon, this was instructive. He saw that power did not disappear when legitimacy was questioned. It migrated. Whoever acted decisively could seize it. Whoever hesitated lost it. This observation would become central to his worldview. Graduating into the French army as a junior artillery officer, Napoleon entered service at a moment when the old order was unraveling. Promotion had traditionally depended on noble birth. Talent mattered less than lineage. But the revolution changed this calculus. Suddenly, officers fled, were executed, or resigned. Vacuums opened everywhere. The army needed competence more than pedigree. For someone like Napoleon, long excluded by birth, this was transformative. Yet, even as opportunity expanded, instability increased. Revolutionary politics were volatile and often violent. Allegiances shifted quickly. Words could condemn as easily as actions. Napoleon navigated this environment cautiously, but not passively. He aligned himself with revolutionary ideals selectively, not out of ideological devotion, but because they dismantled barriers that had constrained him. Equality of opportunity mattered to him precisely because he had been denied it. At the same time, he remained deeply uncomfortable with disorder. Popular violence disturbed him. Uncontrolled mobs represented unpredictability. He believed revolution should be directed, not unleashed, guided, not indulged. This tension between embracing change and fearing chaos defined his relationship with the revolution. He was neither a radical nor a reactionary. He was an opportunist in the original sense of the word, someone who recognized moments of possibility and moved toward them. Napoleon's obsession with order intensified during this period. He became convinced that society could not function without clear authority. Freedom without structure, he believed, dissolved into violence. Law without enforcement was meaningless. These convictions were not abstract. They were reinforced daily as he watched institutions fail to keep pace with events, as he saw indecision punished and action rewarded. His personal life remained sparse. He wrote, often, but intimacy eluded him. Relationships were practical rather than emotional. Even his romantic attachments were shaped by calculation. He sought loyalty, not vulnerability. What others interpreted as coldness was, in part, self-protection. Napoleon had learned that exposure invited attack. Control required distance. By his mid-20s, he had developed a fully formed internal system, a belief that intelligence must serve action, that authority must be visible, that hesitation was fatal, that history favored those who imposed structure during moments of collapse. This system would guide him consistently, sometimes brilliantly, sometimes disastrously. Education gave Napoleon tools, but isolation forged his temperament. Together, they produced a man uniquely suited to moments of crisis, someone who did not seek consensus, someone who did not wait for permission, someone comfortable making irreversible decisions quickly. But isolation also limited him. It narrowed his emotional range. It reduced his tolerance for dissent. It convinced him that opposition was inefficiency rather than feedback. These traits did not yet appear dangerous. In a fragmented world, they looked like strength. France, on the edge of collapse, needed people who could act without hesitation. Napoleon was ready. He did not yet know how far that readiness would carry him, or how much it would eventually cost. Revolutions do not reward patience. They reward speed, adaptability, and a willingness to act before rules are rewritten. Napoleon Bonaparte understood this instinctively. When the French Revolution began, it was not immediately clear where power would settle. Authority fractured rather than transferred cleanly. The monarchy weakened before it disappeared. New institutions emerged before they stabilized. Laws multiplied faster than they could be enforced. Violence filled the gaps left by uncertainty. For many, this environment was terrifying. Careers collapsed overnight. Loyalty became dangerous. Words spoken in 1 month could be fatal the next. Entire classes found themselves stripped of protection without understanding what would replace it. Napoleon saw something different. He saw vacancies. The old system had relied on hierarchy, seniority, and birth. The new system relied on urgency. The army, in particular, was hollowing out. Officers deserted. Others were arrested or executed. Regiments lacked experienced leadership. Discipline eroded. Supplies failed to arrive on time. This chaos was not ideological. It was practical, and practical problems invite practical men. Napoleon did not rush to declare absolute loyalty to revolutionary factions. He remained cautious, observing how quickly alliances shifted. He learned to speak the language of the moment without surrendering control of his own intentions. His political instincts were defensive rather than passionate. Survival came first. Advancement followed. The revolution normalized violence in ways that permanently altered French society. Authority no longer flowed downward from an unquestioned source. It was contested daily, often publicly, sometimes violently. Legitimacy had to be demonstrated, not assumed. Napoleon absorbed this lesson deeply. He watched how crowds behaved, how fear spread, how symbols replaced institutions. He learned that people followed strength not because they loved it, but because uncertainty exhausted them. Order, even harsh order, could feel like relief. This was not cynicism. It was observation. As an artillery officer, Napoleon's skills suddenly mattered more than his background. Artillery was decisive in modern warfare. Guns could break fortifications, control movement, and shatter morale. They required expertise, not lineage. Napoleon's first significant opportunity arrived during the siege of Toulon in 1793. The city had rebelled against the revolutionary government and invited foreign intervention. British forces occupied the harbor. The situation was critical. Losing Toulon meant losing naval access and credibility. The Revolutionary Army was disorganized. Command changed frequently. Plans contradicted one another. Napoleon, still young and relatively unknown, identified the strategic problem quickly. Control the high ground. Control the harbor. Control the city. He proposed a clear, aggressive plan. More importantly, he executed it. The success at Toulon was not merely tactical, it was symbolic. It demonstrated that competence could impose order where ideology had failed. Napoleon's promotion followed swiftly. Not because of loyalty, but because results were visible. From this point forward, Napoleon's relationship with the revolution became transactional. He served it when it served him. He defended it when it provided opportunity. He did not bind himself emotionally to its ideals. This flexibility saved him more than once. The political environment grew increasingly unstable. Power concentrated briefly, then shattered again. Committees replaced assemblies. Generals became suspect. Victories were celebrated, then questioned. Failure, or even hesitation, could be fatal. Napoleon learned to remain indispensable without becoming threatening. He stayed useful, but not yet dominant. He avoided public alignment with extremist factions. He positioned himself as a professional rather than a politician. This distinction mattered. When the reign of terror intensified, many officers were destroyed by association rather than action. Napoleon survived largely because he focused on military problems rather than political rhetoric. His identity remained tied to efficiency, yet even this was not enough to guarantee safety. After the fall of Robespierre, Napoleon briefly found himself sidelined. Connections shifted. Patrons disappeared. Advancement stalled. The system he had relied on changed again. For a moment, he faced obscurity. This pause was instructive. It reinforced a belief already forming. Dependence on any single political structure was dangerous. Systems collapse. Individuals who attach themselves too closely collapse with them. Napoleon adjusted. He cultivated relationships without subordination. He observed political currents carefully. He waited. When opportunity returned, it did so through crisis. Paris itself became unstable. The government feared insurrection. Crowds gathered. Authority hesitated. Napoleon did not. In 1795, during the uprising known as 13 Vendémiaire, he was tasked with defending the revolutionary government. His response was decisive and brutal. He used artillery against insurgents in the streets of Paris. The rebellion collapsed quickly. This moment mattered profoundly. It demonstrated that the revolution, for all its rhetoric about the people, would rely on force when threatened. Napoleon did not hesitate to provide it. He understood that governments survive not by ideals alone, but by control. The government rewarded him again. Command, visibility, trust. Napoleon had now crossed a threshold. He was no longer simply a capable officer. He was a solution to instability. From this point onward, his rise accelerated. The Italian campaign that followed showcased his emerging style fully. Speed, surprise, fragmentation of enemy forces, psychological dominance. He moved faster than opposing commanders expected. He lived. Among his troops, he promised rewards. He delivered victories. Italy was not merely a battlefield. It was a laboratory. Napoleon tested how far authority could stretch when supported by success. He negotiated treaties independently, collected resources, issued proclamations. He blurred the line between military commander and political actor. The government tolerated this because it benefited from the results. Victories stabilized finances. Glory distracted from domestic problems. Napoleon became both useful and dangerous. But danger was relative. As long as momentum continued, the government needed him more than it feared him. Napoleon understood this imbalance clearly. He cultivated loyalty among soldiers rather than politicians. He paid attention to morale. He rewarded competence. He created an identity around effectiveness. His troops believed in him because he delivered consistency in an inconsistent world. Revolutionary France was exhausted by uncertainty. Napoleon offered clarity. Orders were simple, objectives clear, consequences predictable. This clarity created devotion. At the same time, Napoleon learned how to manage image. He communicated victories aggressively. He shaped narratives. He understood that perception traveled faster than truth. Control the story, and you controlled expectation. The revolution had destroyed old symbols but failed to replace them fully. Napoleon filled that void, not with ideology, but with presence. He did not yet seek absolute power, but he no longer accepted limitation. Each success reinforced a central conviction. Authority belonged to those who could impose order when others failed. Legitimacy followed effectiveness, not the other way around. This belief would guide every major decision he made. Yet the seeds of future failure were already present. Constant motion discouraged reflection. Success narrowed tolerance for dissent. Confidence hardened into certainty. Napoleon thrived because the revolution destabilized everything around him. But revolutions do not last forever. Eventually, chaos demands consolidation, and consolidation demands restraint. Napoleon had not yet learned restraint. For now, the revolution remained a ladder. He climbed it quickly, not because he believed in its destination, but because he understood its mechanics. He did not ride the revolution blindly. He used it, and that distinction would soon place him above it. Napoleon Bonaparte did not become a great commander by winning battles alone. He became one by changing how war was conducted, understood, and experienced. What distinguished him was not bravery or even originality in isolation, but integration. He combined speed, logistics, psychology, and authority into a single, coherent system. This system emerged most clearly during the Italian campaign. Italy, at the end of the 18th century, was fragmented. Small states, foreign-controlled territories, and shifting alliances created a complex strategic environment. The French army assigned to the region was poorly supplied, underpaid, and demoralized. Previous commanders had treated it as a secondary theater. Napoleon did not. When he assumed command in 1796, he encountered soldiers who expected little and trusted less. Instead of promising ideology, he promised results: food, pay, victory. His language was direct, his expectations clear. Napoleon understood something fundamental about command. Authority is reinforced by proximity. He lived among his troops. He observed conditions personally. He spoke to officers and enlisted men alike. This visibility created trust, but it also allowed him to assess morale continuously. He reorganized the army for movement. Rather than slow, centralized columns, he emphasized flexibility. Units moved independently but coordinated toward a single objective. This allowed him to exploit enemy hesitation. While opposing forces deliberated, Napoleon acted. Speed became his primary weapon. He moved forces rapidly across terrain others considered impassable. He attacked before opponents fully assembled. He divided enemy armies and defeated them separately. This approach required confidence and risk tolerance. Napoleon accepted both. But speed alone was not enough. He paid obsessive attention to logistics. Supplies were secured locally when possible. Movement was calculated around terrain, weather, and infrastructure. He understood that soldiers who ate and marched well fought better. Napoleon's battles were not improvised. They were prepared meticulously. He gathered information relentlessly. Scouts, maps, reports. He wanted clarity before action, but once action began, he discouraged hesitation. His command style balanced planning with decisiveness. Orders were precise. Objectives were limited. Subordinates knew what was expected and when deviation was acceptable. This clarity reduced confusion and increased execution speed. Psychology played an equal role. Napoleon recognized that morale often mattered more than numbers. He understood fear, anticipation, and exhaustion. He timed attacks to exploit these states. He used artillery not only to destroy, but to intimidate. The sound and sight of concentrated fire unsettled opponents before contact. He also managed his own image carefully. Victories were communicated widely and quickly. Defeats were minimized or reframed. He wrote dispatches that emphasized inevitability. He cultivated the impression that resistance was futile. This impression traveled faster than armies. In Italy, Napoleon also learned to govern. He negotiated with local authorities, extracted resources, imposed reforms. These actions were not secondary to military success. They supported it. The army needed money, food, and stability. Napoleon provided all three through control. This blending of military and political authority was unusual and controversial. But results protected him. The French government benefited from spoils and prestige. As long as success continued, boundaries blurred. Napoleon encouraged loyalty by rewarding merit. Promotion came quickly for competence. Failure was punished decisively. This created a culture of performance. Officers understood that advancement depended on results, not connections. At the same time, Napoleon centralized decision-making. He listened, but he decided. Authority flowed downward clearly. There was little ambiguity about who commanded. This approach created efficiency, but also dependency. The system worked because Napoleon worked constantly. He compensated for gaps personally. He intervened directly when needed. Over time, this would become a weakness. The Italian campaign elevated Napoleon's confidence. He saw that his methods worked not once, but repeatedly. Each victory reinforced belief in his judgment. Each negotiation confirmed his political instincts. But success also altered his relationship with authority. Napoleon began to operate with increasing independence. He signed treaties without full approval. He shaped regional outcomes. He acted as a representative of France, but increasingly on his own terms. The government tolerated this because it lacked alternatives. Other generals could not replicate his results. Napoleon was not replaceable. This imbalance shifted power subtly. Napoleon learned that effectiveness could shield autonomy. As long as outcomes favored the state, oversight weakened. Control followed success, not rank. This lesson would later shape his approach to governance. The Italian campaign also revealed Napoleon's limitations. His confidence sometimes bordered on inflexibility. He dismissed concerns quickly. He believed momentum could overcome resistance indefinitely. Opponents were often disorganized, but not incompetent. They adapted slowly, but they adapted. Napoleon relied on staying ahead. He did not plan for stagnation. Still, his reputation grew. Soldiers trusted him. Civilians feared him. Politicians watched him carefully. He had become a force within the system, not merely a servant of it. Napoleon returned from Italy transformed, not simply celebrated, but self-assured. He had proven to himself that he could shape events rather than react to them. Egypt would test this belief. But before that, Italy established something essential. Napoleon was no longer learning how to command. He was refining how to dominate. His methods were not mystical. They were practical. He studied terrain, managed resources, controlled narratives, motivated troops, integrated politics with force. This combination made him difficult to counter. Opponents prepared for battles. Napoleon prepared for campaigns. He did not seek glory alone. He sought control of outcomes. Yet control carries a hidden cost. It narrows a tolerance for uncertainty. It encourages overextension. It convinces leaders that systems will respond as they always have. Napoleon had not yet encountered a situation where speed failed him, where logistics collapsed beyond repair, where morale could not be restored. For now, his system appeared complete. The making of Napoleon the commander was not sudden. It was cumulative. Italy provided the proof. The revolution provided the opening. Education provided the tools. Confidence completed the transformation. But confidence, once absolute, resists correction. Napoleon's next campaign would reveal whether his system could survive outside Europe, outside familiarity, outside momentum. That test would come soon. Napoleon's expedition to Egypt was conceived at the intersection of ambition, strategy, and illusion. It was not a conventional campaign, and it was not purely military. It was an attempt to expand influence without confronting the strongest enemy directly. It was also an experiment in narrative control, a test of whether reputation could compensate for distance, uncertainty, and failure. France, by the late 1790s, was exhausted. Continuous war strained finances and patience. Britain remained unconquered, protected by the sea and naval superiority. A direct invasion was impractical. Napoleon proposed an alternative: strike at British interests indirectly by disrupting trade routes and projecting French power into the eastern Mediterranean. Egypt, nominally part of the Ottoman Empire but effectively autonomous, offered symbolism as much as strategy. It evoked antiquity, empire, and destiny. To Napoleon, it was a stage large enough to elevate his stature beyond Europe. The decision to go to Egypt also served a political function. Napoleon's popularity unsettled the French government. He was admired by soldiers, celebrated by the public, and increasingly independent. Sending him abroad removed him from immediate political influence while exploiting his talents. Napoleon accepted eagerly. The expedition was unlike anything Europe had seen. Alongside soldiers traveled scholars, engineers, artists, and scientists. Napoleon framed the campaign not merely as conquest, but as enlightenment. Knowledge would march with arms. Civilization would accompany power. This framing was deliberate. Napoleon understood that legitimacy could be built through culture as well as force. He sought to present himself as a modern conqueror, disciplined, rational, and enlightened. The presence of scholars signaled intention. It transformed invasion into mission. Upon landing in Egypt in 1798, Napoleon faced immediate challenges: climate, disease, unfamiliar terrain, and Hostile populations complicated operations. The army adapted unevenly. Supply lines stretched. Communication with France became unreliable. Napoleon moved quickly to assert control. He defeated local forces decisively at the Battle of the Pyramids, a victory as symbolic as it was tactical. He invoked history. He connected his campaign to antiquity. He reinforced the narrative of inevitability. But beneath the symbolism, problems multiplied. Naval defeat came swiftly. The French fleet was destroyed by the British at the Battle of the Nile. This loss isolated Napoleon completely. Reinforcements were impossible. Retreat uncertain. The campaign's strategic foundation collapsed. Napoleon now commanded an army cut off from home, operating in a hostile environment with limited supplies and no clear exit. This was the moment when many commanders would falter. Napoleon did not. Instead, he intensified narrative control. Reports sent to France emphasized victories, reforms, discoveries. Defeats were minimized or omitted. Scholars published findings. Artists documented ruins. Egypt became a cultural phenomenon. Napoleon understood that distance insulated perception. By the time facts arrived, impressions had already formed. He used this delay aggressively. Within Egypt, he attempted governance. He issued proclamations framed in local religious language. He sought cooperation from elites. He reorganized administration. These efforts met mixed success. Cultural misunderstanding and resistance persisted. Violence escalated. Rebellions erupted. Repression followed. The enlightened image fractured under pressure. Napoleon responded with force. He suppressed uprisings decisively. Order was restored, but resentment deepened. His belief that authority must be visible hardened further. The campaign's dual nature, intellectual ambition paired with coercive control, revealed a central contradiction in Napoleon's worldview. He believed progress required order, but order required force. He saw no conflict between the two. As conditions worsened, Napoleon faced a critical decision: remain and risk stagnation, or leave and preserve reputation. He chose to leave. In 1799, Napoleon departed Egypt secretly, abandoning his army to its fate. This act would later be criticized, but at the time it was strategically sound for him personally. His presence in France mattered more than his command in Egypt. Upon his return, the situation in France was unstable. Government credibility had eroded. Military setbacks mounted. Public confidence wavered. Napoleon's carefully managed image filled the vacuum. He returned not as a defeated general, but as a savior. His failures in Egypt were obscured by distance, delay, and narrative control. His successes were magnified. This was the culmination of the Egyptian experiment. Napoleon learned that perception could outweigh reality. That image could survive failure if managed correctly. That authority depended as much on belief as on fact. This lesson would shape the rest of his career. Egypt marked a turning point. Militarily, it was a strategic failure. Politically and psychologically, it was a success. Napoleon emerged more famous, more trusted, and more confident in his ability to shape reality. He had tested the limits of distance and discovered that control could extend beyond physical presence. He had learned to govern through symbols, scholarship, and selective truth. But Egypt also planted seeds of overconfidence. It suggested that consequences could always be deferred, that retreat could be reframed as strategy, that failure could be transformed into myth. These assumptions would not always hold. Napoleon returned to France convinced of his indispensability. He had seen how quickly systems weakened without decisive leadership. He had experienced isolation and survived. He had mastered image. The next step was inevitable. Power no longer needed to be borrowed. It could be taken. By the time Napoleon returned from Egypt, the French Republic was exhausted. The revolution had devoured its architects and alienated much of the population. Institutions existed, but confidence did not. Laws were passed, but enforcement was uneven. The Directory, France's governing body, survived more through inertia than authority. This was not a vacuum. It was something more fragile, a structure that looked intact but no longer commanded belief. Napoleon recognized this immediately. He did not return speaking of Egypt as a failure. He spoke of instability at home, of threats abroad, of the need for decisive leadership. His timing was precise. France was weary of ideological purity and suspicious of weakness. What it wanted was predictability. Napoleon offered order without explicitly rejecting republicanism. This balance was critical. He did not present himself as a usurper. He presented himself as a solution. The coup of 1799, later known as 18 Brumaire, was not dramatic in execution. It was administrative, procedural, carefully staged to appear legal. This was deliberate. Napoleon understood that legitimacy mattered, even when power was seized. The Directory was dissolved under the guise of reform. New governing bodies were created. Authority shifted quietly, almost bureaucratically, into Napoleon's hands. Violence was minimal. Resistance scattered. The public accepted the change with relief rather than outrage. Napoleon emerged as First Consul. This title mattered. It evoked the Roman Republic, not monarchy. It suggested service rather than domination. Napoleon chose it carefully. He was consolidating power while avoiding the appearance of tyranny. In practice, authority centralized rapidly. Napoleon dominated decision-making. Committees existed, but influence flowed one way. Laws were proposed, debated briefly, then enforced decisively. Opposition was tolerated only when it did not impede function. Napoleon's justification was consistency. France needed stability. Stability required clarity. Clarity required unified command. These arguments resonated because conditions supported them. Years of upheaval had eroded patience for pluralism. Many were willing to trade participation for peace. Napoleon did not abolish Republican language. He emptied it of unpredictability. He restructured administration aggressively. Local officials were appointed, not elected. Tax collection was standardized. Education was centralized. The state began to function with regularity for the first time since the Revolution began. Perhaps most enduring was the creation of the Civil Code. It rationalized law, clarified property rights, and standardized legal principles across France. This reform outlasted Napoleon himself. It remains one of his most significant contributions. The Code reflected his worldview: equality before the law, authority of the state, protection of property, clear hierarchy. Rights existed, but they were defined and limited. Freedom in Napoleon's system was structured. Religion was also addressed pragmatically. Napoleon reconciled with the Catholic Church, not out of devotion, but necessity. Faith offered social cohesion. Conflict weakened authority. Compromise strengthened it. The Concordat restored religious practice while subordinating it to the state. This arrangement stabilized society without surrendering control. Napoleon's genius lay not in ideology, but in synthesis. He combined revolutionary reforms with authoritarian execution. He preserved change while ending chaos, yet this consolidation came at a cost. Power flowed upward relentlessly. Initiative narrowed. Institutions functioned efficiently, but depended heavily on Napoleon's oversight. He reviewed details personally. He intervened frequently. He trusted few. This intensity produced results, but it also created fragility. The system worked because he worked. It did not yet know how to operate without him. Napoleon justified this concentration of authority as temporary. France needed guidance, not domination. Order would allow liberty to mature. But temporary measures have a habit of becoming permanent. As first consul, Napoleon enjoyed immense popularity. Victories resumed. Finances stabilized. Roads were built. Schools opened. France felt governed again. Popularity reinforced certainty. Napoleon began to view opposition less as disagreement and more as inefficiency. Dissent slowed decision-making. Debate diluted clarity. In a system built on speed, resistance became obstruction. Censorship increased. Newspapers were reduced. Public opinion was guided rather than expressed. Napoleon believed information should serve stability. He did not yet call this empire, but it was governance by command. Externally, Napoleon continued to rely on war to maintain momentum. Peace, when it came, was temporary. The army remained central to legitimacy. Success abroad validated authority at home. This created a feedback loop. Power required victory. Victory required mobilization. Mobilization required centralized control. Napoleon was aware of this dependency, but he saw no alternative. Europe remained hostile. Coalitions formed repeatedly. Security demanded readiness. Over time, the distinction between necessity and preference blurred. Napoleon's personal authority grew beyond institutions. Loyalty shifted from the republic to the man. Soldiers swore allegiance to him. Officials owed their positions to his favor. France was stable, but stability was personalized. This personalization of power altered Napoleon's own perception. He began to see himself not merely as administrator, but as embodiment of the state. His decisions were France's decisions. His judgment was national interest. This belief did not arise suddenly. It accumulated gradually, reinforced by success and absence of effective challenge. Still, Napoleon resisted monarchy publicly. Crowns carried, associations of decay. But titles evolved. Honors multiplied. Ceremony expanded. Distance between ruler and ruled increased. Symbols followed substance. Napoleon had achieved something remarkable. He ended revolutionary chaos without restoring the old regime. He created a functional state from ideological wreckage. He ruled without a crown. But power without formal definition seeks stability. It seeks permanence. It seeks recognition. The Republic, as structured, depended too heavily on Napoleon's presence. Succession was unclear. Authority lacked continuity beyond him. Napoleon understood this weakness. Order, once imposed, demanded protection. And protection, in his mind, required dynasty. The logic of empire was forming, even if the name had not yet been spoken. Napoleon did not declare himself emperor because he admired crowns. He did it because the system he had built could not survive without permanence. By the early years of the consulate, France was stable in ways it had not been for more than a decade. Laws were enforced, finances were organized, borders were defended. The machinery of government functioned efficiently. To many, Napoleon appeared indispensable. That perception was accurate and dangerous. The Republic, as Napoleon had reshaped it, rested on his authority rather than institutional resilience. Decisions flowed from him. Loyalty attached to him. Stability depended on his presence. The question of succession, still unresolved, lingered quietly beneath the surface. Napoleon understood history well enough to recognize the problem. Power that cannot be transferred peacefully invites collapse. Revolutions often end not because ideals fail, but because leadership lacks continuity. France had already experienced this cycle. Napoleon began to frame empire not as ambition, but as protection. A crowned ruler could ensure order beyond his lifetime. A dynasty could preserve reforms. A title could stabilize legitimacy. This argument was persuasive precisely because it was grounded in fear. Fear of regression. Fear of chaos. Fear of renewed civil conflict. Public opinion, carefully guided, shifted. Napoleon did not rush. He allowed the idea to mature. Support was cultivated among elites, military leaders, and administrators who owed their positions to him. Each understood that their security was tied to his permanence. The Senate, already deferential, moved first. Proposals emerged suggesting that Napoleon's authority be made hereditary. The language was cautious, the intent unmistakable. Napoleon accepted reluctantly, at least in appearance. The coronation in 1804 was meticulously staged. Every symbol was chosen, every gesture calculated. The presence of the Pope lent religious legitimacy. The ceremony itself signaled something unprecedented. Napoleon crowned himself. This act was not arrogance alone. It was declaration. Authority flowed from his own achievement, not divine right or tradition. He was emperor because he had imposed order, not because he had inherited it. The message was clear. Empire did not erase the revolution, it consumed it. Napoleon preserved many revolutionary principles: legal equality, merit-based advancement, centralized administration, while discarding its instability. The empire presented itself as the natural conclusion of revolutionary transformation. Many accepted this logic willingly. Yet empire changed Napoleon in subtle but important ways. Power now demanded symbolism. Distance replaced familiarity. Ceremony replaced accessibility. The ruler became separate from the governed. Napoleon adapted quickly. He understood the importance of spectacle. Uniforms, titles, rituals, these reinforced hierarchy. They stabilized authority by making it visible and unquestioned. Marriage became political. Napoleon divorced Josephine, not out of personal animosity, but necessity. She could not produce an heir. Dynasty required continuity. Emotion yielded to structure. His subsequent marriage into European royalty signaled a shift. Napoleon was no longer merely a revolutionary figure. He was integrating himself into the old order even as he reshaped it. This integration was uneasy. Europe's monarchies never fully accepted him. He was an emperor, but not of ancient lineage. His legitimacy rested on conquest and reform, not ancestry. This made him dangerous. Coalitions reformed. War resumed. Napoleon responded as he always had, with speed, decisiveness, and confidence. Victories followed. Empires expanded. Client states multiplied. Brothers and allies were installed as rulers across Europe. This expansion was not purely aggressive. It was defensive, at least in Napoleon's mind. Each conquest created buffers. Each alliance reduced threats. Each new dependency stabilized the core. But expansion altered the system's balance. The empire grew faster than its administrative capacity. Local resistance increased. Cultural differences complicated control. Loyalty weakened with distance. Napoleon compensated by tightening authority further. Control centralized. Surveillance expanded. Censorship intensified. War became continuous. Victory sustained legitimacy. Defeat threatened it. There was little room for pause. Napoleon's genius remained evident. He continued to outmaneuver opponents. He restructured armies, adapted tactics, and exploited divisions. Yet each campaign demanded more resources, more lives, more attention. The system consumed itself. Napoleon's tolerance for dissent diminished. Criticism became obstruction. Neutrality became betrayal. He expected alignment, not debate. This rigidity did not emerge from cruelty, it emerged from pressure. Empire required certainty. Certainty demanded obedience. Napoleon increasingly trusted his own judgment over that of advisers. Success reinforced this habit. He believed he saw patterns others missed. Often he was right, but no individual sees everything. As Europe adjusted to his methods, resistance evolved. Enemies learned to delay rather than confront, to exhaust rather than defeat, to retreat and regroup rather than collapse. Napoleon's system, optimized for speed and decisiveness, struggled against endurance. Still, the empire persisted. Laws spread, roads were built, administration standardized. Napoleon reshaped Europe structurally even as he destabilized it politically. This dual legacy complicated resistance. Many who opposed his rule benefited from his reforms. Many who suffered under occupation lived within more efficient systems. Napoleon interpreted this as validation. But validation was conditional. Empire had solved the problem of succession on paper. It had not solved the problem of sustainability. The system required constant input from its architect. It assumed continued momentum. Napoleon sensed this but resisted its implications. Slowing down felt like weakness. Compromise felt like retreat. The crown that had secured authority also limited flexibility. Napoleon had become emperor by necessity. He ruled because the system demanded it, but the system, once crowned, demanded constant expansion to justify itself. This was the paradox. Empire stabilized France while destabilizing Europe. Order at the center required motion at the edges. Peace at home depended on war abroad. Napoleon accepted this logic because he saw no alternative. For now, his power remained intact, his armies undefeated, his authority unquestioned. But the system had reached its most dangerous phase, one where success masked fragility. The next challenge would test not his brilliance, but his endurance. By the time Napoleon ruled as emperor, war was no longer an event. It was a condition. This shift did not occur suddenly. It emerged gradually, shaped by necessity, habit, and belief. Napoleon did not begin his career seeking perpetual conflict, but the structure he built made peace increasingly difficult to sustain. War justified authority. Authority sustained order. Order demanded security, and security in a hostile Europe required readiness for war. This circular logic hardened into a system. Napoleon reorganized warfare on a scale previously unseen. Armies grew larger, faster, more mobile. Conscription expanded the pool of soldiers dramatically. Entire populations became involved, directly or indirectly. War ceased to be the concern of professionals alone. It became national. This transformation brought advantages. France could mobilize resources rapidly. Campaigns could be launched with unprecedented speed. Opponents struggled to match the scale and coordination. But mobilization carried consequences. Armies consumed enormous quantities of food, equipment, and manpower. Supply lines stretched thin. Local populations bore the burden. The state demanded sacrifice continuously, not temporarily. Napoleon understood logistics better than most commanders. He planned routes carefully. He requisitioned locally when possible. He calculated movement precisely, but even his system had limits. As wars multiplied, margins for error narrowed. The continental system exemplified this problem. Designed to weaken Britain economically by restricting trade, it required cooperation across Europe. Enforcement depended on compliance from allies and occupied territories alike. Compliance proved uneven. Smuggling flourished. Local economies suffered. Resistance increased. Napoleon responded by tightening control, expanding surveillance, and punishing defiance. Each measure reinforced opposition. What began as economic warfare evolved into political occupation. Napoleon believed pressure could be applied indefinitely, that systems could be forced into alignment through persistence, that resistance would eventually yield to efficiency. This belief had served him well before. Now it encountered diminishing returns. As campaigns continued, Napoleon relied increasingly on momentum. He expected enemies to collapse under pressure. He assumed speed could overcome fatigue. He trusted that discipline would compensate for strain. But fatigue accumulates invisibly. Soldiers marched farther. Replacements arrived less trained. Officers carried heavier responsibilities. Civilian populations grew resentful. Administrative efficiency declined as complexity increased. Napoleon remained central to coordination. He reviewed reports obsessively. He issued detailed orders. He intervened personally. The system still functioned, but it required constant attention. This intensity reinforced his conviction that only he could manage it. Opponents adapted. Coalitions learned not to confront Napoleon directly. They avoided decisive battles when possible. They withdrew, regrouped, and waited. They targeted supply lines. They exploited distance. This strategy did not defeat Napoleon immediately. It exhausted him. War as a system demanded continuous success. Any interruption threatened legitimacy. Any stalemate suggested weakness. Napoleon responded by escalating. Campaigns grew more ambitious. Objectives expanded. Risks increased. He believed boldness would compensate for strain. Often it did, but boldness also magnified consequences. The empire reached a point where stability depended on uninterrupted victory. This was unsustainable. Victory is contingent. War does not obey intention. Napoleon's system discouraged restraint. Pauses felt dangerous. Peace felt temporary. Each campaign created conditions requiring the next. This dynamic altered Napoleon's judgment subtly. He began to interpret caution as failure. He dismissed warnings more quickly. He trusted intuition over consultation. Success had trained him to expect compliance. At the same time, his enemies grew more patient. They accepted losses in exchange for time. They coordinated more effectively. They learned to absorb impact. War shifted from decisive clashes to prolonged struggle. Napoleon's system was optimized for resolution, not endurance. The gap widened. Internally, France felt the strain. Conscription removed young men repeatedly. Economic disruption persisted. Families endured loss without clear endpoint. Support remained, but enthusiasm waned. Napoleon interpreted wavering morale as a leadership challenge rather than systemic exhaustion. He responded with symbolism, ceremony, and appeals to honor. These tools worked briefly, But symbols cannot replace rest. By structuring war as permanent necessity, Napoleon eliminated flexibility. He could not disengage without appearing weak. He could not compromise without undermining authority. He could not slow down without risking collapse. The system had locked him in. This was not obvious at first. Victories continued. Maps changed. Titles accumulated. The empire still expanded. But beneath expansion lay fragility. War had become the empire's organizing principle. Administration served campaigns. Law supported mobilization. Education prepared officers. Economy fed armies. Peace would have required reconfiguration. Napoleon did not attempt it. He believed history rewarded those who pressed advantage relentlessly. He had learned this lesson early. Now it constrained him. War as a system produced clarity at the cost of adaptability. It simplified decision-making by narrowing options. Fight or fall. Napoleon chose to fight. The next campaign would test the system beyond its design limits. Not against a single enemy, but against scale, climate, and time. War had shaped Napoleon's rise. Now it would shape his decline. The invasion of Russia was not a single decision. It was the accumulation of many smaller ones, each shaped by confidence, pressure, and habit. By 1812, Napoleon's empire depended on compliance across a vast and uneven landscape. The continental system required cooperation from every major power in Europe. Russia's gradual withdrawal from that system threatened more than economic policy. It challenged Napoleon's authority. To tolerate defiance was to invite imitation. Napoleon interpreted Russia's behavior not as disagreement, but as destabilization. If one major power could ignore his system, others would follow. The empire would unravel incrementally, not dramatically. He chose confrontation. The scale of the campaign reflected his assumptions. Napoleon assembled the largest army Europe had ever seen. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers drawn from across the empire marched eastward. This force was intended to intimidate as much as defeat. Presence itself was meant to compel submission. Napoleon expected a decisive engagement, a battle that would shatter Russian resistance and restore compliance. He had achieved this outcome repeatedly against European opponents. Russia was different. Russian commanders refused to offer the kind of battle Napoleon sought. They retreated steadily, drawing the French army deeper into unfamiliar territory. Supply lines stretched. Local resources vanished. Villages were abandoned or destroyed. Napoleon advanced regardless. This decision reflected the logic of his system. Momentum had to be maintained. Retreat would signal weakness. Delay would embolden opposition. He believed pressure would eventually force engagement. But pressure requires leverage. Distance eroded it. The farther the army marched, the less control Napoleon possessed. Communication slowed. Coordination weakened. Soldiers suffered from hunger, exhaustion, and disease. Horses died in vast numbers, crippling mobility. Napoleon remained focused on objectives rather than conditions. He believed discipline could overcome environment. He had underestimated the scale of Russia and the willingness of its leadership to absorb losses. When battle finally came at Borodino, it was costly and inconclusive. The Russians withdrew again. Moscow lay open. Napoleon entered the city expecting resolution. Instead, he found emptiness. Moscow burned. Supplies vanished. The symbolic victory offered no strategic advantage. The Russian state did not negotiate. Winter approached. Napoleon waited. This pause was fatal. His system had never been designed for waiting. It thrived on movement, pressure and resolution. In Moscow, there was none. Time became the enemy. As temperatures dropped, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Food was scarce, shelter inadequate, morale collapsed, disease spread, discipline frayed. Napoleon delayed retreat longer than he should have. He hoped for negotiation. He expected reason to prevail. He believed his presence alone would compel response. Russia remained silent. When retreat began, it was too late. The army withdrew along devastated routes. Supplies were gone. Weather turned lethal. Soldiers collapsed by the thousands. Cohesion dissolved. Units disintegrated. Napoleon's authority could not reverse physics. Command became impossible. Orders lost meaning. Survival replaced strategy. The retreat exposed the limits of control brutally and publicly. Napoleon eventually left the army, returning to Paris to stabilize political consequences. This decision was consistent with his priorities. The state mattered more than the army. Image mattered more than presence. The cost was staggering. The Grand Army ceased to exist as a functional force. Casualties reached unprecedented levels. Allies reconsidered loyalty. Enemies sensed vulnerability. The catastrophe in Russia was not simply a military defeat, it was a systemic failure. Napoleon had built an empire optimized for rapid decision and decisive engagement. Russia refused both. It offered space instead of resistance, time instead of confrontation, environment instead of enemy. His system collapsed under conditions it could not control. The psychological impact was profound. For the first time, Napoleon's aura of inevitability shattered. He had advanced with confidence and returned diminished. His authority, once unquestioned, now required explanation. Opponents regrouped quickly. Coalitions formed with renewed determination. The balance shifted. Napoleon attempted recovery. He raised new armies with remarkable speed. He returned to the field. He fought with skill and determination. But something had changed. Experience could not compensate for exhaustion. Genius could not replace numbers indefinitely. Confidence no longer intimidated. The Russian campaign revealed what success had concealed. Napoleon's system depended on assumptions that no longer held. Speed could not overcome scale. Control could not defeat climate. Authority could not command endurance. The catastrophe did not end the empire immediately, but it broke its spine. From this point forward, Napoleon would fight not to expand, but to preserve. Momentum had reversed. Initiative slipped away. Russia marked the transition from dominance to decline. The system that had carried Napoleon to power had finally encountered a limit it could not redefine. The collapse of Napoleon's empire did not arrive as a single event. It unfolded as a sequence of losses, each eroding confidence, resources, and loyalty. After Russia, the illusion of invincibility was gone. Europe had learned that Napoleon could be resisted. His enemies no longer sought decisive confrontation alone. They aimed to exhaust him, to deny him resolution, and to exploit the weaknesses exposed by overextension. Napoleon responded with urgency. He rebuilt his armies at extraordinary speed. Conscription intensified. Youth replaced experience. Officers carried heavier burdens. The army marched again, disciplined but diminished. Napoleon remained a formidable commander. His tactical brilliance did not disappear. He maneuvered skillfully, exploited mistakes, and won engagements. But victories were narrower, losses heavier, recovery slower. Coalitions coordinated more effectively. They avoided fragmentation. They learned to retreat when necessary and to advance together. The strategic environment had changed. Napoleon faced enemies who had adapted. Internally, France strained under continuous demand. Conscription touched nearly every family. Economic pressure mounted. Support persisted, but enthusiasm faded. The empire felt distant from the sacrifices it required. Napoleon sensed this shift, but his response was constrained by the logic of his system. Compromise appeared dangerous. Peace threatened legitimacy. Retreat invited challenge. He fought on. Defeats accumulated. Territory shrank. Allies defected. Kingdoms installed by Napoleon collapsed or switched allegiance. The empire's outer layers peeled away. In 1814, Allied forces entered Paris. This moment symbolized the end of an era. The city that had crowned Napoleon now accepted his enemies. Political elites moved quickly to preserve stability. Napoleon's support evaporated. He abdicated. The terms were surprisingly lenient. Napoleon was exiled to Elba, a small island in the East Mediterranean. He retained title, guards, and a degree of autonomy. Europe wanted him contained, not martyred. On Elba, Napoleon confronted stillness. He reorganized the island efficiently. He planned. He administered. He imposed order even in exile. But isolation weighed on him. Distance from power unsettled him more than defeat. Europe, meanwhile, struggled to define peace. Old regimes returned. Borders shifted. Grievances resurfaced. Stability proved elusive. Napoleon watched carefully. When opportunity appeared, he acted. In 1815, he escaped Elba and returned to France. The response was immediate and revealing. Troops sent to arrest him joined him instead. Authority flowed back to him with startling speed. This return was not driven by nostalgia alone. It reflected unresolved tensions. The restored monarchy lacked legitimacy. The empire's administrative legacy persisted. Napoleon remained a symbol of order for many. The 100 Days began. Napoleon moved quickly to reassert control. He promised reforms. He invoked peace. He prepared for war. Europe responded decisively. There would be no negotiation. Napoleon's return confirmed their fears. Coalitions reformed instantly. Napoleon faced urgency without margin. The campaign that followed culminated at Waterloo. Fatigue, miscalculation, and coordination failures converged. The battle was decisive. Napoleon was defeated. This defeat differed from previous losses. There would be no recovery, no retreat, no rebuilding. Napoleon abdicated again. This time, exile was permanent. He was sent far from Europe, to Saint Helena, a remote island in the South Atlantic. There would be no escape. Napoleon's return had revealed the enduring power of his image. His final defeat revealed the limits of that power. Loyalty could return quickly. It could not sustain itself against unified opposition. The system that had once thrived on speed could not recover from repetition. Surprise had vanished. Adaptation lagged. Resources were exhausted. Napoleon's decline was not solely military. It was structural. His empire had no redundancy. When momentum failed, collapse followed. Exile forced reflection. But reflection did not soften Napoleon. It clarified him. He remained convinced of his logic, of his necessity, of the inevitability of his rise and fall. He framed his defeat as circumstance rather than flaw. History would judge. Napoleon had returned because he believed the system still needed him. Waterloo proved otherwise. Europe had learned to function without him, however imperfectly. The story was nearing its end. But Napoleon was not finished shaping it. Waterloo was not the moment Napoleon became less capable. It was the moment when his system finally ran out of time. By 1815, the conditions that had once favored him had disappeared. Speed no longer surprised. Authority no longer intimidated. Opponents no longer fractured under pressure. What remained was a commander of immense experience, leading an army that could not afford hesitation or error. Napoleon understood this clearly. His return from Elba had been astonishingly swift, but it had left no margin. Europe responded immediately. Armies mobilized. Alliances solidified. There would be no prolonged uncertainty this time. Napoleon had to strike quickly or be overwhelmed. The campaign in Belgium was designed to divide Allied forces before they could fully unite. It was a familiar strategy. Napoleon had used it successfully for years. Isolate, defeat, move on. But familiarity breeds predictability. The Allied commanders understood Napoleon's intentions. They moved, cautiously but cohesively. They avoided isolation. They accepted temporary disadvantage to maintain coordination. Napoleon advanced anyway. His army marched with urgency, but not with the cohesion of earlier years. Many soldiers were young and inexperienced. Veterans were fewer. Command structures remained effective, but stretched. Napoleon himself was not at his physical peak. Illness and exhaustion weighed on him. He delegated more than before. This was necessary, but it altered the system's balance. His command style had always relied on personal oversight. At Waterloo, that oversight was limited. The battlefield itself imposed constraints. Rain delayed movement. Terrain slowed artillery. Timing shifted. Small delays accumulated into strategic consequences. Napoleon's plan depended on coordination and pressure. Neither materialized fully. As the battle unfolded, opportunities appeared and vanished. Decisions were made under uncertainty. Units moved without perfect synchronization. Miscommunication compounded stress. None of this was unusual in war. What was different was the absence of recovery. Napoleon's earlier campaigns allowed for correction. Momentum could absorb mistakes. At Waterloo, there was no reserve of confidence left. Each error mattered disproportionately. When Allied reinforcements arrived, the balance tipped irrevocably. The French army fought hard. Courage was not lacking. But cohesion fractured. Retreat followed. Waterloo ended not only a campaign, but a method. Napoleon's system had always relied on the assumption that decisive action would resolve uncertainty. Waterloo revealed a different reality. Sometimes uncertainty persists despite action. Sometimes coordination matters more than brilliance. The defeat was final. Napoleon abdicated shortly afterward. There were no appeals, no pauses, no reconsiderations. Europe had resolved the question decisively. This time, exile was absolute. Waterloo has often been portrayed as a single bad day. This interpretation misses the point. The battle mattered not because of tactics alone, but because it represented the exhaustion of a model. Napoleon's rise had been powered by instability, his dominance sustained by momentum, his authority reinforced by speed. Waterloo occurred when none of these remained. Opponents were stable. Momentum had shifted. Speed no longer surprised. The end was inevitable once these conditions aligned. Napoleon did not lose because he failed to adapt tactically. He lost because the environment had adapted strategically. His system could not adjust to patience, endurance, and coordination. Waterloo stripped away illusion. It revealed that control has limits, that authority cannot be imposed indefinitely, that even the most effective systems depend on conditions beyond their creator's influence. Napoleon's final journey would take him far from Europe, to a place where no army could follow and no system could function. There, stripped of momentum, he would confront the one condition he had always avoided: stillness. Saint Helena was chosen precisely because it erased possibility. The island sat isolated in the South Atlantic, distant from Europe, distant from influence, distant from consequence. It was small, difficult to reach, and easy to monitor. There would be no return, no second escape, no ambiguity. For Napoleon Bonaparte, this was the final transformation, from ruler of systems to subject of them. The British treated him with calculated restraint. He was given a residence, limited attendance, and a fixed routine. His movements were monitored, his correspondence controlled. Every detail reinforced a single truth: authority no longer belonged to him. Napoleon reacted as he always had. He attempted to impose order. He reorganized daily schedules. He corrected procedures. He debated protocol. He demanded recognition of his title. These actions were not vanity alone. They were instinct. Control had been his method of survival for decades. On Saint Helena, that method failed. The island did not respond to efficiency. There were no institutions to reorganize, no armies to command, no momentum to harness. Time moved slowly, indifferent to intention. Napoleon struggled with this stillness. His health declined gradually. Physical ailments compounded frustration. The climate aggravated illness. Medical care was limited. Yet physical discomfort troubled him less than irrelevance. He had lived his entire adult life inside motion: campaigns, reforms, decisions, crises. Stillness stripped away context. Without systems to manage, he confronted memory. Napoleon responded by shaping narrative. He dictated extensively. He recounted campaigns, corrected interpretations, framed motivations. He emphasized his role as reformer and stabilizer. He justified decisions. He minimized errors. He explained necessity. This was not deception alone. It was preservation. Napoleon understood history as a battlefield. Reputation outlived power. If he could no longer command events, he could still influence how they were remembered. Saint Helena became a final campaign. One fought with words rather than armies. He presented himself as a man shaped by circumstance rather than ambition. A leader forced into war by hostile powers. A reformer betrayed by exhaustion and coalition. There was truth in this portrayal. There was also omission. Napoleon acknowledged mistakes selectively. He attributed failure to weather, betrayal, and timing more than structure. He framed Russia as misfortune rather than systemic flaw. He treated Waterloo as culmination rather than exposure. This selective reflection revealed something essential. Napoleon had never doubted his logic. Even in defeat, he believed his system had been correct, only overwhelmed. He did not see restraint as a viable alternative. He saw it as abdication. Saint Helena offered no opportunity to test that belief. Isolation intensified memory. Napoleon replayed decisions repeatedly. He compared outcomes. He argued with absent opponents. He justified choices aloud. Those around him observed fluctuations. At times he was sharp, commanding, energetic. At others withdrawn, irritable, fatigued. The mind that once coordinated continents now navigated confinement. Yet Napoleon never surrendered identity. He insisted on dignity. He maintained ceremony. He corrected visitors. He refused to accept the language of defeat. These behaviors were not delusion. They were continuity. Napoleon had always believed that authority began internally, that self-perception shaped action. On Saint Helena, this belief sustained him, but it could not restore relevance. Europe moved on, borders stabilized, monarchies adapted, institutions absorbed and modified his reforms. The world reorganized without him. This was perhaps the greatest defeat. Napoleon had reshaped Europe structurally, but not permanently in his own image. His legal and administrative reforms endured. His political dominance did not. Saint Helena revealed the distinction clearly. Napoleon died in 1821. His death was quiet, unceremonious, far removed from the theaters where his reputation had been forged. There were no final commands, no dramatic reversals, just an ending. Yet endings do not conclude influence. Napoleon's legacy persisted in contradiction. He symbolized both revolution and empire, order and domination, reform and exhaustion. He demonstrated what decisive leadership could achieve and what it inevitably consumed. Saint Helena stripped away momentum and exposed essence. Without control, Napoleon remained convinced. Without power, he retained certainty. Without audience, he still argued his case. This was not stubbornness alone. It was coherence. Napoleon had lived according to a single internal logic from youth to death. He believed history favored those who imposed structure during chaos. He believed legitimacy followed effectiveness. He believed control was preferable to uncertainty. These beliefs had lifted him from obscurity to empire. They had also carried him beyond sustainability. Saint Helena was not punishment, it was conclusion, a place where power could no longer outrun consequence, where systems no longer responded to will, where motion finally ceased. Napoleon Bonaparte is often remembered as an exception, a singular force who bent Europe to his will. But his life is better understood as a pattern. He did not rise in isolation. He emerged when institutions weakened, when legitimacy fractured, and when speed became more valuable than tradition. His success depended on conditions as much as capability. Napoleon demonstrated how order can be imposed quickly when systems fail. He showed how clarity can replace confusion, how decisiveness can stabilize chaos. But he also revealed the cost. Control centralizes responsibility. Success narrows tolerance for dissent. Momentum discourages pause. Systems built on constant motion struggle to adapt to endurance. Napoleon's empire collapsed not because he lacked intelligence or courage, but because his system required conditions that could not persist indefinitely. History does not reward dominance forever. It rewards adaptation. Napoleon adapted brilliantly, until he could not. His reforms endured because they were institutional. His rule ended because it was personal. This distinction defines his legacy. Napoleon was not simply a conqueror. He was an organizer of power, a designer of systems, a man who believed chaos could be mastered through will. Sometimes he was right. Sometimes will created chaos instead. Napoleon's life reminds us that effectiveness is not permanence, that control has limits, that speed solves problems until it becomes one. He was not inevitable, he was possible, and that possibility remains.